let's talk about budgeting. Come on, be honest. For a lot of us, that word just brings up images of endless spreadsheets and, being told no. But what if we're looking at it all wrong? What if your budget wasn't a restriction, but more like a strategic playbook for actually winning? That's exactly what we're going to get into today.
So let me ask you this. Does this sound familiar? You and your team spend months putting together the perfect annual budget. And then, bam! A competitor launches something new. Costs go haywire, and suddenly all those carefully laid plans feel completely, totally out of date.
If you're nodding your head right now, you are definitely not alone. That feeling of your plan just crumbling almost as soon as you hit print, it is a massive, massive challenge, especially in the world we live in today. So in this explainer, we're going to break down some much smarter, more adaptive ways to think about financial planning. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to put a finger on exactly what's broken with the old way of doing things. Then, we'll dive into a whole playbook of powerful solutions, everything from little tweaks to a complete overhaul. And we're going to end by asking a really radical question. What if the best solution is to just get rid of the budget entirely? So, before we can talk about solutions, we've got to get real about the problem. Let's break down precisely why that classic fixed annual budget just fails so often. And you can see this domino effect, right? The budget becomes obsolete almost immediately. So what happens? It encourages that classic use it or lose it spending frenzy at the end of the year. And that just protects old costs instead of challenging them. You literally end up just copy-pasting last year's inefficiencies into the new year. The big takeaway here? Sometimes the system itself is what's fundamentally broken.
All right, so our first solution hits that problem of a static plan head on. Let's talk about something called flexible budgeting. The core idea here is really simple, but it is so powerful. You plan for a range of outcomes, not just one single number you hope you'll hit. It works by splitting your costs. That formula on the screen just means you take your fixed costs, like rent, and you add your variable costs, which is just your cost per item times how many you actually make or sell. This lets you ask a much, much smarter question. Okay, for the sales we actually achieved, or are costs what they should have been? So, what's the catch? Well, you get this incredible adaptability. Your plans are way more accurate, and managing performance becomes so much more meaningful. The downside? It's the upfront work. It can be genuinely tough to sort all your costs into these neat little fixed and variable buckets, especially if you have a lot of those tricky indirect costs.
Okay, so flexible budgets are great for adapting to different sales volumes. But what happens when the whole landscape shifts halfway through the year? For that, you need a way to keep the budget itself constantly fresh. And that brings us to rolling budgets. Oh, I love this analogy. A traditional budget is like printing out directions from MapQuest back in the day before a big road trip. A rolling budget, that's your GPS. It's constantly reevaluating, rerouting, and giving you the best path forward based on what's happening right now. And here's how it works in the real world. At the end of every quarter, you don't just look back. You add a new quarter to the end of your forecast. This means you always have a constantly updated 12-month view of the future. It forces everyone to regularly rethink their assumptions and helps you stay way ahead of the curve. The huge pro here is accuracy. Your plans are always relevant, which is absolutely critical in unpredictable industries. The main drawback? It's the effort. This is a time-consuming, nonstop process. And yeah, you might hear some managers complain that you're constantly changing the goalposts for their targets. Okay, our next approach tackles a totally different problem. You know those huge, mysterious overhead costs that just seem to be a black box? Well, activity-based budgeting, or ABB, is the tool designed to shine a bright light right into that box. So instead of just lumping all your indirect costs into one big overhead bucket, ABB forces you to ask what activities are actually eating up these resources. Is it setting up machines, processing purchase orders, doing quality checks? By budgeting based on the volume of those activities, you get a much truer picture of what it really costs you to serve your customers. The big win with ABB is efficiency and accuracy. No question. You get a much truer sense of your product costs, and you can start to spot all that non-value-adding work that's just draining resources. But this is not a quick fix. We're talking about a complex, expensive project. And honestly, it might not be worth the headache if your indirect costs aren't that big a deal to begin with. All right, now for something that's truly radical. What if, instead of just tweaking last year's budget, you threw it in the trash and started completely fresh
every single year. Well, that's the wild idea behind zero-based budgeting.
This quote right here, it just gets right to the heart of it. The starting point isn't last year's spending plus 3%. The starting point is zero. Every single dollar of spending, from paper clips to salaries, has to be justified from the ground up every single time.
And the process is incredibly disciplined. The best way to think about it is like a company-wide episode of Shark Tank. First, you define the teams. Then the managers have to create these detailed pitches, or decision packages, for everything they want to spend money on. Finally, senior leadership looks at all these pitches and puts the money behind the ones that best match the company's biggest goals. So what's the result? Well, ZBB is absolutely amazing at allocating resources smartly and killing off old, obsolete activities. It makes every dollar fight for its life. The massive downside, though, is that it's just incredibly time-consuming for everyone involved. And there's a real risk it can make people prioritize easy-to-justify short-term wins over those crucial long-term strategic bets. So far, we've looked at 4 different ways to improve the budget. But what if the problem isn't the method we're using, but the entire idea of budgeting itself? This brings us to our final and maybe most profound idea. This is the big, provocative question asked by the Beyond Budgeting movement. What if that whole traditional, top-down, command and control system that budgeting represents is actually what's holding modern companies back? Now, it's really important to get this. Beyond budgeting is not just another technique. It's a full-on cultural shift. It's about replacing those rigid annual targets with more adaptive ways of managing performance. It's about empowering teams on the ground to make decisions quickly, guided by principles and benchmarks, not by some fixed plan that's already a year old. And the potential payoff here is huge. The people who advocate for this say it creates faster, way more innovative organizations. I mean, think about it. It directly attacks that use it or lose it problem by motivating managers to actually reduce costs. And by focusing on things like customer value and relative performance, it builds a culture of constantly getting better. And that really leaves us with this one fundamental question. As the world just gets more and more unpredictable, should we double down on trying to control things through numbers, or should we embrace agility and lead through principles? There's no single right answer here, but it's a question that I think every modern leader really needs to be asking. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.